So I'm going to cover the change, or I'm sorry, new changes to definitions in regards to contaminated soil and dredge material and clean soil and dredge material. In the previous rule, the definition of a contaminated soil was tied to only materials coming from cleanup sites and dangerous waste facilities, since that was how those soils were defined. That left lots of questions all these years about how the rule, if the rule applied to contaminated soil coming from other locations, or how a person should manage those materials. Examples like street waste from street cleaning, known to have automobile chemicals and exhaust residue, soils containing cementitious materials that lead to high pH soil, and soil like from other industrial sites or other releases from spills or historical activities. So the lack of clarity in the rule, because of the definition we had, meant agencies had to make case-by-case decisions on where these materials should go, relying on guidance documents for some materials and uses. This made enforcement really challenging, often leading to statewide inconsistencies for how materials get managed from one county to another, and made enforcement really, difficult. And then in some cases, industry set its own standards, puts them in the position of potentially using materials in ways that could be harmful to humans in the environment or violate other standards. And so we felt we needed to change to how we captured these materials. Next slide, please. And then regarding contaminated dredge material, the rule tied standards for upland use based on meeting the standards for contaminant concentrations for disposal in open water. While this might be fine for open water, it's not necessarily safe in upland locations, and so we needed to revise the definition for that to ensure that we had, safe uses that wouldn't create a problem when placed in upland spots. Next slide. Okay, so in the revised rule, we changed the definitions for clean and contaminated soil to make it clear that the rule applies to all soil and dredge material that are affected by the release of a contaminant that will be moved from one location to another to be stored or placed on the ground. So I want to go through those things in a little more detail. So release of a contaminant means something has altered the quality of material at more than de minimis amounts. So the de minimis standard we have allowed in the rule is to ensure things like small equipment oil leaks or remnants of cement dust on construction site aren't releases. They're not going to affect something at more than a de minimis amount. And similarly, naturally occurring metals in soil or naturally high or low pH soils, those are not contaminants in the rule. So where you have those conditions with natural background, we're not going to say that's not a contaminant as we define it. Regarding movement from one location to another, this just means that soil sitting in the ground with contaminants, it's not solid waste required management of solid waste if it's just sitting there. Similarly, if you excavate a material to put it right back where you excavated it from, we are not subjecting you to any standards in the rule either. So for that example, there's a lot of projects where you amend a soil with jet grout because you need that as an engineering feature for your project. You could just leave that right in place without anything happening because you added a product to the soil. So if you, by extension, pick that material back up, and that's kind of the idea for how those projects work, but you find a way to use it right back on that site, we're not going to say that's all of a sudden solid waste management in this rule because you have a material that has been impacted. You're putting it right back where it was. We're not trying to capture something like that activity. And then for the storage replacement on the ground, this means only soils going to be used on the ground are subject to the standards, not soils that are going to be landfilled at a permitted landfill facility or that are going to a treatment facility permitted to handle those materials. Only the standards for acceptance at those sites would apply to you. Not meeting the standards that I'm going to talk about for clean versus contaminated materials. Next slide. Okay, so what are the standards we have in place? So until now, by and large, assessing the appropriate use of materials has been determined by avoidance of creating a cleanup site. So what we did was try to model the changes to our definition accordingly. So the use of the state's cleanup rule which is the Model Toxics Control Act, otherwise referred to as MOTCA, is largely how industry and health agencies have been addressing problems with soil management over the years. So the goal is to allow use of material in a way that is protective and prevents liability for cleanup under MOTCA. And if you're able to do that, you are managing a clean soil, and so you are not captured as a solid waste facility. The rule allows the use of soil or dredge material containing contaminants at any location as long as the concentration of contaminants would not exceed a state cleanup level for those locations under our state cleanup rules. We also have set a pH standard for releases that affect the pH of material, and we have that at 4.5 to 9.5, or in line with natural pH conditions where you're planning to put such materials. So using the materials in ways that are allowed in the rule is considered clean soil or clean dredge material handling, which is not solid waste handling and excluded from the rule applicability section. This is real similar to if you land apply manure at an agronomic rate, it's also excluded from the rule. So it's a material as well as the use that are excluded. And the uses that are not going to meet a MOTCA or pH standard are subject to solid waste regulations, so they're not prohibited necessarily, but they might come with permit conditions. We do have limited purpose landfills that take contaminated soils. We have treatment facilities that are usually captured under the pile storage section. So it's not that you can't do the things you want to do, but it might require an approval or permitting process that goes with that. And you can always choose to manage your materials at an existing solid waste facility, without being bothered with our definitions at all. Next slide, please. So I do want to say that the rule doesn't apply to several activities, and a lot of these are all excluded in the applicability section of the rule. I did talk about them earlier, but I'm not sure everybody who's interested in this section was on early today. So materials placed in ways that obviously meet the cleanup rules or pH standard for placement is considered clean soil or dredge material management, which is not a solid waste handling activity. Anything that might designate as a dangerous waste is not captured under this rule at all. Our hazardous waste regulations apply to management of things that have contaminant limits at those levels. So this rule is only for solid waste management. If you're managing a contaminated material within the confines of a cleanup site, being cleaned up in accordance with the Model Toxics Control Act, we are not going to say this rule needs to be used to address any management there. If you have dredge material placed back into or adjacent to water, those are covered under Federal Clean Water Act rules. And engineered soil that's going to be used elsewhere for the same engineering properties, we consider that reuse as we define it. And we hope that if you have an engineered soil, you can find a project to use it on so that it doesn't, you don't have to worry about the high pH that often comes with those materials. And then, as I mentioned a couple times, contaminated soil that you remove from the ground temporarily, you don't alter it, and you place it back where it was, is not going to be captured as a solid waste handling activity under this rule. And this last item, I want to make it clear too, or we tried to make it clear that it is not meant for certain things. Like if you have soil from some processing facility or industrial or commercial facility, it's not meant to allow you to just spread that stuff from a process back out on your facility grounds. For example, backwash solids from a drinking water treatment facility cannot simply be disposed on the treatment facility property. The idea for the exclusion is that any new impacts are avoided, not potentially created. So the picking up temporarily and putting back is really, whatever impact that material already had, it still has. You haven't done something new with it. And then same for some, adding something new to a material between the time you excavated it and then put it back. The idea is to not alter the properties of the material that was already there. And then we tried to further characterize the movement by stating that it can't be distant within a large or linearly large site so as to create a new environmental impact. This was meant to address comments we had about, hey, I have really long street projects. Can I move my material from one end of it, 2 miles away? And this is not meant to exclude that from the rule. You would need to look at any new impacts that you could be creating at the new location you'd want to place it. Next slide. All right. right, so what do we really mean? So MOTCA has several methods for setting cleanup levels, and it's quite a complex rule. There's methods A, B, C, unrestricted land use versus industrial land use, the need in some cases for terrestrial ecological evaluations, accounting for drinking water protection standards. So what does this mean for managing soils affected by release of a contaminant? So by and large, MOTCA Method A for unrestricted land use, the cleanup levels set for those are going to be safe in the vast majority of places. So the Method A unrestricted contaminant limits account for the highest human health and drinking water protections. So it does set a cleanup level for about 30 of the most common contaminants that are out there. And it can work if ecological considerations are not significant. If ecological considerations are apparent, you know you're placing materials where in an endangered species habitat or something along those lines, you would have to adjust the contaminant concentrations down to be protective of those ecological receptors. And there are tools within the MOTCA rule to figure that out. And then, like I said, Method A accounts for about 30 or so contaminants. So Method B is okay for looking at contaminants that are not listed there. Method B has, cancer and non-cancer contaminant limits, and you'd want to consult with your health department or ecology staff to figure out if you've got something that's outside of that Method A list. And then Method C is not going to be appropriate. These cleanup levels are really high and apply only to the worst of cleanup sites. Those cleanup sites would have the most restrictions about leaving contaminants on a property. And so Method C isn't something that I don't think will be used in any case regarding contaminated soil management under this rule. And then the pH standard is going to primarily apply where you have done something to affect the pH of your soils. And so, engineered soils is something I keep mentioning. They have cementitious materials. These types of soils have resulted in pH of 11 or 12 or higher. That never lowers once exposed to environmental conditions, or it takes a really long time. And so what that can do is leach metals out of your soils, and we think that needs some safeguards if you're going to be placing that in the environment. And I'll just reiterate something earlier, that if you have a naturally high or low pH or naturally high, metal concentrations, those are not releases of a contaminant, so they're not going to be subject to capture under this rule if you've got a naturally occurring something or other in your soils that you're excavating. Next slide. All right, so I just want to say outright that we went into this process to acknowledge, hopefully, that most soils moved are considered clean. We really tried hard not to capture the movement of all soils around the state. We don't have any adequate resources to be able to follow dirt around all over the place. So things like soil excavated from previously undeveloped land that you're developing, or removed from residential areas that aren't otherwise exposed to industrial impacts. You don't have to assess whether you think there's been a release just based on the fact that humans have lived there or been around. We've tried to provide examples in our definitions for clean soils that acknowledge that. Similarly, soils that are excavated from areas protected under impervious surfaces, and this has actually already come up. So if you have something that's been protected under pavement and there's no reason to believe there's been a release under that pavement previous to placing that, you can consider that soil clean. And so, in line with this too, deciding whether you have to characterize your material based on suspected releases is really going to be up to the judgment of soil handlers and concerned agencies if complaints come in. We don't specifically require testing outright, but the idea was to provide standards for placement that are consistent across the state, that aren't going to lead to problems, and that are enforceable should somebody be managing materials in ways that aren't meeting the standards and so therefore are harmful where they're being placed. Next slide. Okay, so ecology is going to create guidance on soil management. We did actually try to provide an entire rule section devoted to soils and appropriate contaminant limits for appropriate uses. And we had to, revamp the way we were addressing soils in the rule based on extensive public comments. So the idea now is to create guidance that provides some clarity on what we mean in terms of managing materials that are impacted by release, but that can otherwise have legitimate uses out there, and that don't have to be landfilled. So we're going to propose in that guidance to address common materials subject to potential characterization and evaluation for use. Things like street waste, engineered soils, dredged materials coming from contaminated waterways, soils that you might just have general suspicions about. So the hope is that we'll set, what appropriate list of test parameters would apply to that material. That way, you don't have to you don't have to test for 600 contaminants out there. If you have street waste, you would test, you'll test for the list that we provide in guidance, hopefully. We'll address contaminant limits, some common uses that we believe are appropriate, and then, when ecological considerations might come into play too. And we are going to update, so there's a couple existing guidance documents out there right now that have dealt with some of these materials over the years. We are going to update the language in those rules in those guidance documents because this rule does now supersede those. We have a rule now that has been adopted as opposed to a guidance document. And so we will be updating those in time here. My hope is that we'll have guidance, I'll have guidance created, I'll be writing that over the winter, and so it should be available, and I want to consult with our internal staff and our toxic cleanup program as well. So with that, I will gladly take any questions.
All right, we've got a few questions here. First question is from Tricia. Why would Method C not apply to industrial sites?
So if you look at MOCA, Method C is really for the worst sites, so where you have contaminant limits so high or they're a specific contaminant that you can't even meet a cleanup standard for it, and therefore they might require at those sites capping and placement of environmental covenants and groundwater monitoring networks. It's a really limited circumstance for cleanup sites to even be able to use Method C. And that's why I don't feel like it would ever be appropriate for managing soils under this rule.
Okay, and then a follow-up question from her. Please clarify if doing an independent cleanup, not a consent decree or order under MOTCA, which involves consolidating and capping contaminated soil on site, then the soil will not classify as solid waste. I will send that in the chat.
So we have excluded in the applicability section management within a cleanup site. That includes independent cleanup, voluntary cleanup program, or those sites under orders or consent decrees. As long as you're cleaning up a site in accordance with MOTCA, you are excluded, and everything's going to be managed within the confines of that site.
Okay, great. And a question from Keith Johnson. I thought Method B needed ecology approval to use on a specific site.
We are not talking about cleanup sites here. We are talking about management of material not subject to cleanup, but are going to be moved around and nonetheless have release of a contaminant in them. So Method B is, for a cleanup site, it is allowed where you have multiple contaminants. For example, it accounts for increased cancer risk. And so it's a totally different standard if you're a cleanup site than if you're managing materials under this rule.
And a question from Ryan Ransavage. Will there be any stakeholder input on recommended testing in proposed guidance?
I will probably reach out to some stakeholders, yes. We had a rather large stakeholder group in this rule development process. I don't know how much public outreach we will do. There is no formal process set up right now, if that's the question. She's asking if it's okay to degrade a site. So if you can place materials that are nonetheless under a cleanup limit, but the levels of material, but the site itself is even lower, this is not tied to a comparison to the conditions at the place you're taking it necessarily. So if you are meeting the cleanup levels that would otherwise apply to a site like that, and like I said, MOCA Method A, unrestricted, is safe in almost all circumstances. you're going to be allowed to place it there. You do not have to characterize the site of placement prior to deciding whether you can manage materials there.
And another follow-up question to that, can local health departments apply more stringent rules?
I do not believe they can. So we have consulted with our attorneys throughout this rule development process on a lot of things, including authorities and the ability for health departments to revise definitions that stem from statute. So solid waste is one such definition, and only ecology has provided the authority to provide clarity of definitions where we kind of decide legislative intent in their definitions. And so with that in mind, you know, this definition of solid waste in 350 includes contaminated soil and contaminated dredge material. And so we don't believe by extension that health departments could revise those definitions.
And we have a question from Jeff Rudolph. Would soils removed from a roadside ditching project, temporarily stored at a pit site and then later used for a roadway project, be considered solid waste? The area where the materials were removed have no evidence of a release or spill.
So we have a definition for street waste, and street waste is one of those materials we presume contains contaminants because they're captured and runoff from road surfaces. You know, they accumulate and can concentrate materials in those ditching areas where stormwater runs off the road right into them. That is somewhat their purpose, is to prevent those contaminants from going straight into a waterway or something else. And so you, as the person managing those soils, depending on the roadway and depending on the ruralness or primitive nature of where you're removing those, could decide potentially if those are clean soils. But by and large, street waste that's getting managed in that matter is presumed to have contaminants in them. And so the temporary storage at another location would be subject to our pile storage section. So if you are only placing it at a spot for 90 days or less, the rule's not going to kick in. And if you're placing them at another location, you know, you have to be sure you're meeting the limitations that would apply to whatever cleanup levels would be set for that site as well, because that is what is clean soil management under the rule.
All right, and a question from Logan Davidson. Just to be clear, facilities accepting soil less than cleanup levels do not need additional permits. Accepting soil above the limit would require a permit. What permit specifically?
That is correct. And the permit that would apply to people taking in materials that are above a cleanup level that would apply to that site, it's a limited purpose landfill is the category in this rule that would apply to that. So limited purpose landfills capture everything pretty much outside of municipal solid waste landfills and inert waste landfills. So if you're managing a solid waste, any other kind of solid waste, the limited purpose landfill section captures any of those things. And we do have contaminated soil receiving facilities that are limited purpose landfills.
I'm seeing a hand up from Dawn Marie here.
I just wanted to clarify, I wasn't sure from the way that last question was worded, if question included just taking contaminated soils for fill, but of course we also have the option of taking contaminated soils under a piles permit. I may have missed that part of the question, but I just wanted to clarify that.
I understood it to be permanent placement, so I talked about landfills. Yeah, if you're just temporarily placing it somewhere and you aren't meeting the conditions for exemption in pile storage, then it would be the pile storage section that would apply. Or potentially transfer station if you are placing that, you know, if you're putting it temporarily somewhere prior to disposal at another location, the transfer station section would be subject or would cover that activity too if it's endorsed.
We have another follow-up question from Logan Davidson. What would the permit be for a combined inert waste? Oh goodness. What would the permit be for combined inert waste and greater cleanup level soils acceptance permanently at a facility B?
That whole facility would become a limited purpose landfill. Inert waste landfills are required to they're limited to only accepting inert waste. And that's by our statute. That's how they define inert waste landfills. So they would only be able to operate as an inert waste landfill and take in clean soils, because clean soils are not solid waste. And so if you've got an inert waste landfill that's taking soils that have contaminants limit that don't meet a cleanup standard that would apply, then they would need to convert their permit over to a limited purpose landfill permit. And Bill will talk about that later. It doesn't require a specific liner system, so it's possible to have a limited purpose landfill too, where on-site soils can be shown to be protective, that you can show groundwater monitoring that might not be needed depending on what your acceptance criteria is. So it really just depends on the kinds of materials you would plan to receive.